Welcome to this lecture on disability and inclusion. Now, the objectives of this recorded lecture is to start with exploring the historical perspectives to disability in the UK. So we're going to go back quite a long time to about kind of like the 1050 era, all the way through to modern day, so we can track how disability was perceived in the UK historically and the kind of impact of that as we've got to kind of where we are today. We're then going to understand how disability is defined in the UK, exploring kind of the Equality Act of 2010 as a way of understanding that. We'll have a look at the medical and social models of disability and how they influence our society in the way that we think and perceive disability. And then we'll have a look at some of the organisations that are involved in kind of being advocates for disability and equality and different ways of thinking around disability. So that's kind of the structure of this recording. So as a starter task, it'd be really useful if you can pause it at this point and make some notes. And then as we go through the lecture, you can start to challenge some of the things that you wrote down against some of the stuff that's being discussed in this session. Now, it might be that there are some agreements and what you've written down actually aligns with some of the stuff we talk about. But actually, you might also find that there's some disconnect and some of the things that you wrote down might not fully connect with this type of stuff that we're going to talk about in this lecture, which is completely fine as well. So 3 questions for you to think about as a starting point. What types of disability are there and how do they occur? And just use your own knowledge base. So you don't need to research anything. Just kind of write down what you think in terms of the different types of disabilities and then how these different types of disabilities occur. What types of sports do people with disabilities take part in? You might have some knowledge about sports that are adapted or just some sports that are played by people with disabilities generally. And what types of sports and events are there for those with disabilities? And obviously the flagship, the main kind of event we would say is the Paralympic Games, but there might be, so that's one, but there might be some other events both internationally and nationally and actually also maybe locally as well. So pause it at this point, write down some of your thoughts, and then when you unpause, I will continue with the lecture. So kind of use this point now to pause it. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at the starter task, and just keep those kind of notes in front of you and keep making notes and building notes as we go through this recording. As a starting point, like we said earlier, we're going to have a look at kind of the historical perceptions and kind of the historical perspective of disability in the United Kingdom. So we're going to go right back to the medieval period, which was kind of like it says at the top there, 1050, tracking it through to close to the 1500s. And in this period of time, obviously the population was much smaller globally and within the UK, but disability was still common. And there were kind of 3 main causes of disability in this era, which was being born with a disability or being disabled by diseases. And in this period, then there were obviously a number of diseases that were debilitating or led to lots of people dying. And obviously medical treatments were nowhere near as advanced as they are in the modern day. So people became disabled through disease and then becoming disabled by back-breaking work because in this period, the work was very heavy in terms of kind of manual labour and the physical toll that will put on people would lead to people developing disabilities. Now, beliefs towards disability were mixed in this era. So some people believed that disability was a punishment for sin. So you've done something wrong or someone else. Or through like other people, like parents and siblings, for example. So that was one general belief. There was also this belief that disabled people were closer to God. So those that kind of suffer on earth would get to heaven sooner and be rewarded when they get to heaven. So kind of their punishment was happening on earth. And there was also, going back to that first point about punishment for sin, there was also this belief in terms of like astrology, that disability was kind of linked to astrology and the way that the kind of planets were and stuff like that. So there were kind of mixed beliefs around disability. The provision and care for people with disability was limited, and actually not only limited, but it wasn't really provided by the state as we see in the modern day. So people with a disability weren't really cared for, and therefore the care was mostly provided through religion. So, for example, through churches and by monks. And these people in these institutions would kind of support, clothe, feed and teach people with disabilities. Not only just people with disabilities, but people who were ill, people who were poor, for example. So these kind of religious people and religious institutions would often provide support for people who were less well off and didn't receive support from the state or from kind of their fellow human beings. So therefore they would provide this level of care. And hospitals started to emerge in this period, which included specialised hospitals for diseases, including blindness and physical disability. And the first mental institution was created in this period of time. So actually, to kind of summarise, what we can say about kind of the medieval period and medieval people were that religious institutions were pioneers for providing a specialist response to disability. And some of the great work that we see in the modern day around supporting people with disabilities, we were starting to see some of this gain traction all the way back in this period, mainly through religious institutions. However, we'll fast forward to 1485 to 1660, so we'll kind of explore the 16th century broadly. And what we saw in this era was Henry VIII ordered the demolishing of religious houses and drove monks and nuns out. Most hospitals and care unfortunately operated in these spaces, and therefore through this change in approach, most kind of hospitals and care for people with disabilities kind of didn't exist anymore. They were kind of removed. So go back to kind of 1050 through to the kind of 15th century, and we were seeing some really pioneering things around supporting people with disabilities, mainly through religious institutions. And then Henry VIII kind of undone all of that work in this period, leaving care for disabled people to become more of a civic duty rather than a religious matter. And therefore, rich people started to create or fund buildings for people with disabilities, but it was more to enhance their reputation rather than good. And what we saw previously was religious institutions doing this for good, because it was the right thing to do for people and the right thing to do for society. What we started to see in this period was a privatisation of that, where rich people would fund buildings that are needed because these buildings were now demolished and didn't exist, but it would enhance the reputation of their name. And in this era, learning disability still wasn't recognised, and therefore people who today we would recognise with learning disability were actually put to work at court to provide wisdom and humour. And interestingly, there's kind of evidence from back in this era that the court system was quite mundane. So therefore, people with a learning disability would be used to kind of add that level of humour that people felt like they needed within this system. Which obviously isn't something that we would see today, and isn't something that we should encourage. But this was kind of disability back in the 16th century. Okay, and then moving on to kind of through to the 18th century, so kind of 1660 through to 1840. 1932, and we started to see a shift in thinking. So all the way through like 600 odd years of our history, disability was linked to astrology or God or kind of linked to sin. But actually now the thinking was very different. It was more that disability is something which was a loss of reason, and that could be restored with treatment. So what we started to see was a shift where medically and through kind of psychologists, people started to believe that disability was something that we could treat and we can rehab, rather than something that was linked to some idea about astrology or God. So we started to see the first special schools created, because there was this belief that special schools can be a place to put people with disability, and then we can support those people in this bespoke institution and hopefully attempt to restore these people. We also, not just in schools, we also started to see that across buildings. So we started to see institutions, hospitals, obviously schools we spoke about, being built with that belief that disabled people should be in these specialised places, and that belief was growing amongst the population. So we started to see in this era some of the stuff that we see today, but not maybe slightly more extreme, around people with a disability being segregated and separated into more specialised provision. And then we get to the kind of pre-war era, so kind of in the 19th century, and we had the Industrial Revolution, which meant we had the building of mass factories and railways and buildings, which replaced the existing kind of landscape of fields and villages. And that led to a significant increase of buildings for people with a disability. However, what we also saw was a shift in focus politically and socially at this stage, because of the Industrial Revolution, against those people that were without jobs. So new workhouses were created, which essentially was designed to kind of root out people who were deemed to be kind of scroungers or shirkers, and not work. And these places were harsh, they were miserable places to live, and if you were unemployed, this is where they would send you. So there were 350 created across the UK. But most able-bodied poor people did what they could to avoid these, because these were very harsh places to live. So therefore they would work. So kind of, whether we like the system or not, this idea about creating this bespoke place, which was not very nice for people who were lazy, as the rhetoric was back then, meant more people worked. The knock-on effect of that was these places were then filled by people who couldn't work, which typically were disabled people or people at the time that were judged to be mentally ill. So whilst we also had a significant increase of buildings specifically for people with disabilities, other people with disabilities also were kind of moved into these really harsh and miserable places to live, called workhouses. And then if we explore disability in kind of the modern era, but we're not quite up to the modern day yet, so we're kind of looking through the war, or the wartime, there was a growth in belief of eugenics. And there's a direct quote that we can take in relation to that. So, and this has come from kind of newspaper at the time, from a leading thinker, who was the chairperson of the Eugenics Society. And in 1930, this is what he wrote. "What are we going to do? Every defective man, woman and child is a burden. Every defective is an extra body for the nation to feed and clothe, but produces little or nothing in return." And what eugenics is essentially is this idea that we can change the type of person who kind of lives on this planet. So people, in this case, this horrific statement about the burden that people with disability are putting on society. Well, if we had fewer people with disability, then we would have less of a burden. So therefore, we want less people with disability. So at its most extreme, people will be killed because of the way they look, or in this case, because of a disability that they have. So there was a growth in that belief in the UK. So we've got this idea about disabled people being put in specialist places and they can be rehabilitated. And now we've got this belief that actually that's a burden we don't really want anymore. And that rhetoric was kind of going around the UK. But then we had the First World War. And in that war, nearly 2 million newly disabled British ex-servicemen came home because they were disabled in war. So obviously a lot of people died, but also a lot of people were injured, which led to a disability. And in the UK, we have this this view, and I'm not saying I disagree with this, but we have this view that people who go to war are heroes. So now we've got millions of British ex-servicemen coming home from war, now with a disability. And this idea from the kind of growth in the belief of eugenics about people with disability are a burden, well, we can't say that about people who've gone to war to fight for this country. So attitudes started to change and people started to be more supportive and conducive of disability. So society essentially adapted for these heroes. And that had an impact on people who didn't go to war or didn't become or be disabled through war, but actually they had a disability already. So the knock-on effect of the attitude changing for people who come back from war now with a disability are those in society with a disability already also would have been positively impacted by the way society viewed them. So we started to see new housing for people with disability. We started to see the government kind of push employers to take on disabled workers, and advances in medical aspects such as plastic surgery. Now, we also at this time kind of saw large numbers of children with a disability for various reasons, and therefore there was an increase in special school provision. Now, in World War II, which was relatively not too kind of far past the First World War finishing, because mostly men went off the war, there was a significant shortage of workers left in the UK because men who had jobs went off to war, and those jobs needed filling. And we know already that this was kind of the era of women starting to work, which was brilliant for our society. But we also saw people with a disability kind of be pulled into these workplaces. So now, just to kind of fill the gaps left behind, we saw recruitment drives aimed at people with disability, and then a general belief that actually people with disabilities can work and can contribute to kind of work in society. And then since the end of the Second World War, so since kind of 1945, this belief that eugenics that happened, that was growing in the UK, actually we saw it happen in Germany. So we saw it through Nazi Germany and through Hitler. So they had this belief about the Aryan race, and they killed lots of people off based on different factors, but these people didn't fit the mold of the kind of Nazi belief of human beings, and the most extreme and worst case that we can think of is Jewish people, and the kind of Holocaust. But what we also saw in Germany was the mass killing of disabled people, and eugenics became globally increasingly despised as an idea. So therefore, the opposite of that is a variety and a diverse range of people is a good thing. So that belief started to grow. And in 1944, we saw the Disability Employment Act, which was kind of a landmark act because it focused on supporting people with disabilities in work. And there was initiatives aimed at disabled servicemen to try and kind of keep these people engaged in society and back into employment. And there was the invention and growth of the Paralympic Games, which essentially started in England for injured servicemen and has grown to the kind of level that we know in the modern day. In the 1950s, we also saw lots of protests and movements to take action against disability discrimination, poor access and inequality for people with disability. And that's kind of continued through to the modern day. We've seen advances, but those protests and movements still continue today. Now, in terms of disability sport, there's different types of sports that people with disability typically play, and they're generally divided into the following three categories. So the first one is kind of people with sensory impairments, so sports that are focused on athletes or participants with sensory impairments. The second is physical disabilities, so people with a physical disability, and the third is learning disability. So that's from a sports perspective. What we need to do is kind of understand what constitutes a disability, what is a disability. And under the Equality Act of 2010, if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities, you have a disability and you are protected by the Act because of your disability. So you cannot be discriminated against in employment and other kind of locations and environments as well. But what's really interesting in that are the terms substantial. So how do we define substantial? It's a little bit more than some. It's kind of subjective and open to interpretation. This notion of long term as well. Is that 3 months, 6 months? Is that 10 years? There might be some disagreement or subjectiveness on the term long term. And then this negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. Well, first of all, what's a normal daily activity? And then how negative does it have to be? How negative does that effect have to be for it to be deemed a negative effect? So there's quite a lot of subjectivity to this, but this is essentially what disability is defined as in the UK through the Equality Act of 2010. Now, we said at the start we're going to view this through the kind of different models, medical and social models of disability. So this is the medical model of disability. And essentially, through the medical model, this encourages the belief that the disabled person is the problem because they are defective. And this medical model, essentially, if you think about hospitals and hospitalizations, it kind of works from an efficiency perspective, but it doesn't necessarily work that well in society. So if we think about this as in, the starting point is someone has a disability. And if they have a disability, they are classified as faulty. They're not normal, they have an issue, they have a fault of some sort. So then we diagnose that person. And when we diagnose that person, we might say, okay, you have cerebral palsy or you're on the autism spectrum, and therefore we've labelled you, we've categorised you. Therefore, your impairment that you have, your cerebral palsy, or the fact you're on the autism spectrum, that becomes the focus of attention. So people become very focused on how we can support that particular impairment. So how can we support you with cerebral palsy, or how can we support you with autism? Rather than looking at the kind of holistic person, we kind of focus in on that particular need. We therefore assess, we monitor, and we create programs or therapy or rehabilitation, and we impose that on people because of their disability, or going back to that start point, because of their fault. And therefore we segregate people and we create what's called alternative provision or alternative services, because we don't want, or not necessarily we don't want, but we don't believe that the most effective way is a mixture. We actually think would be more effective if we segregate and separate people based on their disability. And therefore the ordinary needs of people with a disability tend to be put on hold because that focus is so much on supporting their impairment. And then once we've rehabbed that person, once we've rehabilitated that person with a disability, they can re-entry if they're deemed normal enough, or they might be permanently excluded if that disability is long lasting and they will remain segregated for long term or for the rest of their life. So that's the kind of medical view of disability. And in the hospital, it kind of works from an efficiency perspective, because if people have similar impairment needs to others, we can group those people together, and doctors and nurses can be trained on those impairment needs, provide medical care in an efficient way, because they might be placed in a particular room or a particular part of the hospital and have people with particular skill sets or knowledge bases support them. However, in society, it's more of an issue because it views the person with a disability as the problem. The social model of disability flips it round, and it will say actually the social structures that we have are the problems, and the way that we view people with a disability, that's the problem. The problem isn't the person with the disability, it's actually the people who view the person with a disability as being different or being the problem, where actually that's where the issue kind of lays. And then we can kind of, if we look at the green circle on the outside of that, then we've got issues around segregation, inaccessibility. That could be physically not being able to get certain places, or institutional in terms of kind of not having access because the organisation doesn't have policies in place to allow you to access. We've got social prejudice, and then we've got cultural and religious belief issues around this. So these social structures that we have in place around these four areas in the green are real problems, but we've created them. We as a society have created these issues and this way of living in society, and unfortunately that links to all of these kind of arrows around the outside where there's a fear of people with a disability, or people with a disability are fearful. We underestimate and we devalue, make people with disability feel devalued. We have sheltered kind of workshops for people and segregated services for people with a disability. We overprotect people with disability and kind of hide them at home, which is really awful when we think about it logically. We've got a lack of education for people with disability because we take, like from a sport perspective, we take them out of PE lessons because they cannot cope with PE. But the reality is the problem is with the teacher and the students, not the person with a disability. We have inaccessible transport and facilities, and all of these issues, or inflexible and employment, for example. Someone's got a disability, so we cannot employ you. We cannot cater for your impairment-specific needs, and unfortunately, all of these issues lead to people with a disability kind of being closer or in that poverty bracket. And kind of having greater likelihood of being in social deprivation, which is a real problem. So people with disability, typically the data shows us that they're more likely to be in social deprivation because of a number of these issues. So what are we going to do about that, or what are organisations trying to do about that? And we've got a number of organisations that kind of take on this advocacy role and try and protest or become the voice for people with a disability and provide better provision within the disability space or the inclusion space. And one very large one is Activity Alliance, and they operate within the kind of physical activity and sport landscape as well. So if you've never heard of them, I would suggest do a little bit of research around the organisation, who they are and what they do. They're a really big advocate for people with disabilities in the UK, particularly around sport. And then we've got this organisation called Listen to Me, trying to provide a voice for people with disability, but not just providing a voice for them, but trying to create systems where people with disability can actually contribute and talk, and people can listen to them, because quite often people with disability are kind of powerless in terms of their voice, which is really sad, and others will assume and talk on their behalf rather than listening to people with a disability. Another organisation is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or what's known as ASAN. And they kind of have this... so they've got this notion of advocacy and self-advocacy, and trying to create or suggest or change public policy and perceptions, but using people, in this case, because this is an autism group, using people with autism to support, or not just support, but have a voice within this group to try and shape public policy. So they're kind of disability organisations as advocates seeking to influence the policy process and kind of what we do in the UK, both politically and socially, and also within sport. And then we've got disability rights from a UK perspective. So we see lots of marches and protests and lots of kind of work to try and change the policy around disability rights in the UK. And unfortunately, a number of the policies that are created in the UK in terms of negative ones around kind of cuts of funding and cuts of support, usually, and not always, but usually impact people with disability more than other groups of people in the UK. So disability right groups in the UK play a very important role in trying to continue to fight for greater disability rights and greater equality. And within disability, it's really important to kind of recognise this kind of what's called like this multiplier effect of like disability and exclusion. So we can view lots of groups separately. So different races and ethnicities, different genders, different age groups, and the marginalisation of those groups is a real issue in our society in the UK. But when we start to group some of these groups together, so for example, people from an ethnic or racial minority and also with a disability, we've now got this multiplier effect. So we know that you've got greater barriers and you're more likely to face social deprivation or inequality if you're from particular ethnic backgrounds in the UK. We know that if you have a disability, and when we put those two things together, we've kind of multiplied the negative effect on those people, and that's a real issue for people who kind of and then we can add other layers on of gender. So if we've got a woman from a BAME background who's also has a disability, then that multiplier effect is even greater. And if we now add on that person is older, and we now add on that person comes from a very low social class background, then life is really complicated and difficult for these people. So this multiplier effect within disability and exclusion is a real worry. And one example there in terms of an organisation that tries to support this is the Birmingham Inclusive Sports Fest, in terms of trying to support people from a range of groups, but where they kind of have a number of these groups kind of in common with the same person. So what can we do in terms of the sport and landscape? What we can do in terms of our delivery to support this and support people with disability? Well, what we can do is we can adapt our practices and we can modify our practices. And there isn't necessarily a universal coach and leadership concept, and there certainly isn't a universal one for disability, but there is lots of great resources that you will find online and kind of out there through governing bodies around how we might adapt and modify practices to support disability and inclusion. Now, there is a history of kind of adaptation, and essentially that's really important in terms of people with limited mobility, and that's where most of the focus is gone. So it was mostly on kind of physical disabilities. So we can find that information relatively easily, I hope, and there are also courses out there to support coaches and leaders with this. But one of the quick and easy tools, it's not necessarily quick and easy, one of the tools that we can use is what's called the inclusion spectrum, and this works broadly around lots of different inclusion groups, but if we look at this from a disability perspective, so the inclusion spectrum, what we've got is activities that we might put on place as a coach or as a leader, and we can include people with a disability within our activities and the way we put that on in kind of one of these four aspects. We've got open activities, modified, parallel, and separate activities. Now, an open activity is a simple activity, and everyone in the group can do it, and we don't really need any or very few modifications for that to work. So we can have people with a disability, people without a disability, all doing the same activity, and we don't really need to modify it. It kind of works for everyone. So a really obvious or good example of that might be boccia. If you don't know what that is, you might want to have a quick look. It's an activity that can be participated in by a number of different people, including people with disabilities, and we don't really need to modify it. So that's an open activity. Then we got a modified activity. So everyone does the same activity. So we've got people with a disability and people without in the same activity still. But we're going to modify it, And we might modify the whole thing, but if we do, that becomes a bit of an open activity. Or we might modify it differently for different people. So we might set challenges, we might provide support, we might scaffold support for people. So people with a particular physical disability might have a more supportive task or support from the coach, and people without a disability who are excelling in the group in terms of their ability might be challenged more, might have a particular challenge to focus on within the activity as well, or they might be limited or restricted in the activity in terms of the space that they can go, or the number of touches they can take, or etc. So there's ways that we can modify activities so everyone's still doing the same activity as such generally, but there's many modifications that live within that so everyone can join in. And then at the bottom we've got a parallel activity. So we group participants according to ability, and we do that generally in sport anyway. We might have a higher ability group and a lower ability group, but we can also do that in terms of ability and disability. So we might, as an easy example, we might split the group into two separate groups, not necessarily equal in number. We might run an activity for people on pitch 1, and then on pitch 2 we might have people with a disability doing the same thing, the same sport, the same activity, but they're going to be grouped with people who have similar impairment needs, for example. So that's a parallel activity. We might make it more complicated than that. We might have people with a disability and without on the same pitch, and we might have multiple pitches or courts or activities set up, but kind of the parallels where we group people, they do the same thing essentially. It can be a bit different, might have different size pitches, slightly different tasks, but roughly the same thing. But we split out across multiple groups, and that's what's called a parallel activity. And then on the left we've got this separate activity. So this is where we might have we still might have multiple groups, but the group of people with a disability might do something very different to the group of people without a disability. Or even if we're just in a disability setting, we might have people with a physical disability in group 1 and people with a kind of learning disability in group 2, for example. So, but the tasks that the groups do are different. So in a parallel activity, they're essentially the same. In a separate activity, they're very different, and they're bespoke to the impairment needs or the needs of the people taking part in that activity. It could be the same sport, but a very different activity, and that's a separate activity. So this is what's known as the inclusion spectrum, and is a very useful tool that we can use as coaches and leaders if we're going to embark on any coaching with people with disability. And that could be in the disability space broadly, or that even could be in more of a mainstream space where we might have 1 or 2 people that might attend with a disability.